feel it. I hear it now. I hear it now with clarity. Oh boy, now I got a problem here. I lost my display, Sam. Oh, there we go. I got it. All right, I decided to change the title since I'm moving from, we're taking much longer than a survey. For the longest time, this started out as a survey in 2023 of the Old Testament. And we were going really fast for a while through Genesis and Exodus and raced through Leviticus. And even Numbers, we started slowing down more and more until we got to Deuteronomy, and we were averaging a chapter a week, and now we're covering the same verses as last week. So at this point, we're about to go in reverse. But I want to, last week I didn't quite get finished with the passage. And I don't really want to spend a lot of time on what we covered last week, but I do want to read the verses we read last week. And I want to focus on this phrase of purging, which appears a lot in Deuteronomy. I think I counted 7 or 8 times, to purge evil from your midst. And I have them written down, which we'll just kind of glance at them in a few moments. I titled this the Purity Revolution. We have in American history something called the Sexual Revolution. And a revolution is a great amount of change in a short amount of time. The reality is that most of the world before Christianity got there lived in what later they would call the sexual revolution. Purity, chastity is not strictly a biblical concept, but to the degree that the Word of God calls men and women to be pure, it really is pretty uniquely almost Christian. I mean, I don't know all the intricacies of how they practice things in India or Islam, but in the Bible there's a desire for purity for all of God's people, for men and for women, particularly in the New Testament, and by that I mean chastity. And so when we read this, it's easy to also forget that the Israelites themselves were surrounded by fertility cults that looked a lot more like modern society than what we think of being a biblical society. Lots of prostitution. When we studied Leviticus 18, which I have a few verses from Leviticus 18, it makes it clear that the Egyptians and the Canaanites practiced incest, bestiality, homosexuality, adultery, all sorts of fornication, and human sacrifice, which inevitably follows a loose sexual ethic. When you have lots of people engaging in intercourse, you're going to have lots of unwanted children. And I've said this before, but I don't. We might get the idea that pagans are saying, "Oh, I love my deity so much, I want to give them the best gift I can." I don't think that's the case. I think people were like, "Well, I have this unwanted child. I want to give it to Baal, right? So I don't have to feed it. So I don't have to take care of it because it interferes with my future, my economics." And so really the same motivations that fuels the abortion movement today fueled human sacrifice in cultures all over the world. So actually a purity culture is the anomaly. It's going against the grain of much of history. But as we're going to look, it also brings about a stability to the family, to the culture, to the commonwealth that allows for human flourishing, for the best conditions for raising up children, the best conditions for educating children, for stability of the family. The modern ethic, the modern sexual revolution has led to a lot of mental illness, a lot of chaos, a lot of guilt, fractured families. Economically, I mean, who can argue that having one nuclear family under a roof isn't a better way to prosperity than multiple children through multiple women or multiple children from multiple men? It's the chaos that we see sprouting up all around us has economic consequences and social consequences and crime in so many areas. And so when we read these laws again tonight, and this time I'm going to finish the chapter, and the tendency is to look at them and say, oh my goodness, this is such, well, for lack of a better word, overkill, because it involves the death penalty in several places. And this phrase of purging evil from your midst is used of the death penalty many times. And we read that today and people are like, oh my goodness, they're embarrassed of it. But when you look at all the consequences that come and you see the cause and the effect of not having a purity culture, you're going to have bloodshed. You're going to have huge financial ramifications. And all of society is going to bear it, and lots of innocent blood's going to be shed. And so when you think of this idea of purging evil, the purpose, when we look at this phrase of purging evil from your midst, as it's used especially in Deuteronomy, but also in the New Testament, it's quoted in a passage about a man having his father's wife, which is right here. When you read that phrase, the purpose of purging the evil is so that it doesn't spread. You know, if you ever look out on your lawn and you see one dandelion, what's going to happen if you don't uproot that dandelion? Yeah, that's a softball. You're going to have a lot of dandelions, right? And it's a constant work to uproot dandelions. But the more uprooting you do, the more you can keep it at bay. You let it go for a little while. I mean, your neighbor's dandelion seeds are still going to fly into your yard. But if you've got like a big field, if you don't constantly deal with it, it's going to proliferate, and soon you're going to have a whole lot of dandelions in your yard. And I'm fine with dandelions, but what happens when evil is tolerated in the church, and I mean all sorts of evil, you're going to get more of it. When you take away the shame of sin in society, you're going to get more of it, and all the consequences that come from it. So God's plan for a godly law order is the putting away of evil. Now in the New Testament, we're not merely trying to keep evil out of the church, which that is something that we're trying to do. We're also trying to influence a pagan world with the gospel of Jesus Christ. We're given this commission to go into all the world, teach all nations, baptize in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost, teaching them to observe all things I have commanded you. And I believe that includes Deuteronomy 22. We teach the nations to honor all of God's word and the moral lessons that are taught there, at least in general equity, the general principle of it. So Paul, everywhere he goes, he addresses purity, chastity, and like epistle after epistle, even Hebrews, it slipped in one verse, a few verses. It's in there because it was such a big issue all over the world. In Corinth and Ephesus and Galatia, all sorts of license is practiced. Now, Paul doesn't say, hey, let's have an execution once a week. He doesn't do that because in the church, you put away evil in a different way. In our personal lives, we put away evil one way, and the church another way. In the civil order, which the New Testament church had very little control over the civil order, yet another way. And in the family, another way still. And so for each sphere of sovereignty, for the individual, for the family, for the church, and for the state, all of them have a form of purging evil, because if you don't purge it, it increases like dandelions. And so that being said, let's read our text. And I'm going to read the passage we've already covered, but I don't want to spend a lot of time on the dowry of virgins, except for general principles, because we talked about it a lot last week. But I'm going to read it because I almost didn't read it, but this phrase, purging evil from your midst, is there. So here we are, Deuteronomy 22:13. If any man takes a wife and goes into her and then hates her and accuses her of misconduct and brings a bad name upon her, saying, I took this woman, and when I came near her, I did not find in her evidence of virginity, then the father of the young woman and her mother shall take and bring out the evidence of her virginity to the elders of the city gate. And the father of the young woman shall say to the elders, I gave my daughter to this man to marry, and he hates her. And behold, he has accused her of misconduct, saying, I did not find in your daughter evidence of virginity, and yet this is the evidence of my daughter's virginity. And they shall spread the cloak before the elders of the city. Then the elders of that city shall take the man and whip him, and they shall fine him 100 shekels of silver, and give them to the father of the young woman, because he has brought a bad name upon a virgin of Israel, and she shall be his wife. He may not divorce her all his days. But if the thing is true, that evidence of virginity was not found in the young woman, then they shall bring out the young woman to the door of the father's house, and the men of the city shall stone her to death with stones, because she has done an outrageous thing in Israel by whoring in her father's house. So you shall purge the evil from your midst. If a man is found lying with the wife of another man, both of them shall die, the man who lay with the woman and the woman, so you shall purge the evil from Israel. If there is a betrothed virgin, and a man meets her in the city and lies with her, then you shall bring them both out to the gate of that city, and you shall stone them to death with stones, the young woman because she did not cry for help, though she was in the city, and the man because he violated his neighbor's wife. So you shall purge the evil from your midst. But if in the open country a man meets a young woman who is betrothed, and the man seizes her and lies with her, then only the man who lay with her shall die. But you shall do nothing to the young woman. She has committed no offense punishable by death. For this case is like that of a man attacking and murdering his neighbor, because he met her in the open country. And though the betrothed young woman cried for help, there was no one to rescue her. If a man meets a virgin who is not betrothed and seizes her and lies with her, and they are found, then the man who lay with her shall give to the father of the young woman 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife, because he has violated her. He may not divorce her all his days. A man shall not take his father's wife, so that he does not uncover his father's nakedness. So last week we covered this, and when the first passage that we covered last week is in the case of a man falsely accusing a woman of not being a virgin, when he had, and this is the context, he had given a dowry of virgins already, which would be 50 shekels of silver in those days, to the family of the bride. So it's a dowry of virgins. It was something that a virgin daughter deserved 50 shekels. Anybody happen to remember what 50 shekels was approximately in years of wages? 3 years, right? When he falsely accuses her, he is fined an additional 100 shekels. That's twice the dowry of virgins. He's already given 50 shekels, which is 3 years. Now he's fined an additional 100 shekels, which is approximately 7 years' wages. Remember, that's what Jacob worked for Rachel. And then he worked another, ended up working for Leah and another 7 for Rachel. It was a very significant amount of money. Enough money to deter anybody from doing it. And that's the purpose of a deterrent, is to deter the crime from happening. So his penalty was practically slavery, to have to work for so many years. Another thing that would happen to him is he would be whipped. He would be publicly beaten, which 40 lashes is definitely a deterrent. Being whipped publicly for falsely accusing a woman of Israel, being whipped 40 lashes, very serious deterrent, right? And the third deterrent was he may not divorce her all his days. So if he hated her, he absolutely cannot divorce her, right? So that it was that was enough to deter him. Now this, some say, well, why wouldn't he be put to death for doing that? In fact, that was brought up last week. Well, one reason why I believe is the consequence of fatherlessness. If she is already conceived, I mean, he's got to take care of her, right? And this is something that all of this passage deals with, chastity in the marriage. And I looked up some statistics on fatherlessness. I just want to look at them for a moment to really get why the penalties are so high. Whipping, 7 years' wages, being not able to divorce the person forever, which is what he wanted in the first place. He's not permitted to do. And in the case if the woman's guilty, being put to death and purging. Why such serious consequences? Well, here's some thoughts. Statistics about fatherlessness. 63% of youth suicides are from fatherless homes. 90% of all homeless and runaway children are from fatherless homes. 85% of all children who show behavior disorders come from fatherless homes. 80% of rapists with anger problems come from fatherless homes. 71% of high school dropouts come from fatherless homes. 75% of all adolescent patients in chemical abuse centers come from fatherless homes. 70% of juveniles in state-operated institutions come from fatherless homes. 85% of all youth sitting in prisons grew up in a fatherless home. Some general facts. Girls from fatherless homes are more vulnerable to being lured into exploitive situations outside the family. Teens without involved fathers are twice as likely to drop out of school. Girls raised in fatherless homes are more than twice as likely to become pregnant before the age of 18, and that's out of wedlock. Teens from single-parent households are more likely to engage in delinquent behavior compared to those from two-parent households. Adolescents without involved fathers are at a higher risk of experiencing emotional and psychological problems. Teens without fathers have an increased likelihood of substance abuse and addiction. Fatherless teenage boys are more susceptible to involvement in criminal activities. And here's another statistic on abortion. 63,459,781 total abortions since 1973, based on numbers reported by the Guttmacher Institute, 1973 to 2017. 63,459,781 sacrificial victims due to abortion. So, when we read these laws about the dowry, which required a lot of a young man to save up for a dowry, and purity and executions for adultery, and for all these phrases about purging evil, which refers to the death penalty, and you think about how seriousness it is, and it like at first sound it's like, whoa, that's really extreme. But if you look at the consequences of where we've gone since the sexual revolution as a nation, the consequences of not obeying God's law are very severe. Yes, you got a mic? We need a mic over here. Dan needs a mic.
Thank you. I think I'm a very good example of what you're talking about. Not only was I raised in a house without a mom, but my dad was there, but he wasn't there all the time. He was trying to find a new wife and all that stuff. And like I told you and many other people, what I gone through, I went through a whole bunch of, I rebelled against God, and I got stuff from that. And by the grace of God, though, thankfully from Him, I was still able to find a wife and have a son. Mm-hmm. But this just points out, like you said, it's very important to have the household of the mother and the father together.
Two-parent households are ideal. And I think it's important when we are in a widow and widower situation, we need to be aware of it and come alongside those situations as well. To be a father to the fatherless is a very high virtue. James 1 says that pure religion is to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction and to keep yourself unspotted from the world. Now, I don't have statistics. I went to some government websites and found these statistics, but and if anybody wants them, I still have them on my computer. I could give you the source. I didn't write it down because it's a Bible study. I'm not writing a book, but I'd be interested in seeing if we've had long enough since 1973. What's the mortality rate at what ages? What about obesity? What about type 2 diabetes? I'm confident that you would find there as well when you have I'm pretty sure you would see negative consequences even in health to single income homes, just experientially. I'm confident that's the case. So there's all kinds of, and this is all about likelihood. It's not to say that every child raised by a single parent turns out a certain way, or that all children with two parents don't go that way. But it illustrates something that a lot of times the consequences of God's law, we read God's law and we're like, oh man, that's so harsh. But we don't see the unintended consequences of our sin. And God in his wisdom, the author of the world, is the author of the word, and he wrote the instruction manual, and he'll be like, man, that seems like that, from my human vantage point, that seems extreme. But God in his wisdom puts this in his word because he knows what is best for his people, for his children. And God wants human flourishing. He wants us to alleviate human suffering, and his law is one way in which we do that. So the idea of purging the evil from our midst is so that the family is protected, because it's the basic building block of society, of the social order, is the family. And I think that there's other consequences we could talk about. I mean, I'm hearing the statistics about the younger generation. There's a group of men called MGTOW, men going the other way or their own way. A lot of men are like, it's so easy to get divorced, have children, and lose everything. And the no-fault divorce, which, by the way, was introduced into our country by a Californian governor. Anybody know who he was? Governor of California that introduced no-fault divorce. He's a big name. Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan. So that has unleashed a great evil in our society. And people look at that, they go, well, we can save so much money and time. The courts are backed up adjudicating divorce. Back in the day, you had to prove fault. You had to demonstrate. The government said, we're going to hold people accountable to their vows and oaths. And then, you talk to the average libertarian, a lot of libertarians are like, well, that's not the government's business. But the reality is, when you don't restrain evil, when the civil government doesn't restrain that evil, all these consequences are going to follow. And it may not be immediately apparent to people, but it's actually one of the roles of civil government is to restrain evil. So that's another great evil in our society, is the no-fault divorce, that people can just say, well, I don't love each other. We don't love each other anymore, so we're just going to, agree to disagree and break up, like it's a high school sweetheart or something. And it has very big ramifications. So when God says, put away the evil from your midst, the purpose is it affects the whole social order. It's not a solitary sin. It affects the entire social order. And so it's of serious consequence. Yes?
What was before no-fault divorce? Did the government just say, no, you can't get divorced?
Okay, so the question is, what was before no-fault divorce? I wasn't alive then, and I haven't studied it, but I believe they had to prove fault. If you would know, yeah, Brian?
Well, I just know that there was a precedent case.
You need a microphone because people are watching, and they're always appreciative when they can hear, but is my mic? I believe it's still working. Yeah, I hear it.
I don't know the answer to this, but there was a precedent case set, and I learned it from one of the tapes you loaned me from one of the great, theological speakers and lawmen from I can't think of his name now.
Herb Titus?
Yes, Herb Titus. And he said the case of Marvin versus Marvin. That was Lee Marvin and his wife who were going to get a divorce, but it was very messy, and it started a big argument about property and jurisdiction over children and everything else. And that was what set the precedent case in California for the family court to be established.
Is that right?
Yep.
Yeah, I believe fault would have to be proved. So people would be proven adultery or extreme abuse, something of that nature, and then they would, you could get a divorce, but it was a lot of trouble. It wasn't a light thing to get married, and it was a very big deal to get a divorce. So yeah. Let's look at, here's kind of, we kind of covered this a little bit. In verse 22, if a man is found lying with the wife of another man, both of them shall die, the man who lay with the woman, and the woman, so you shall purge the evil from Israel. We talked about this last week. Talked about the woman caught in adultery. Dan brought that up in John 8. Of course, they said this woman was caught in the very act, but they only brought the woman. They didn't bring the man. God's law required the man and the woman. And this was already a very unpopular law at the time of Christ. The Pharisees really liked divorce. I know I read a quote from Josephus. Josephus even admitted to getting a divorce himself, for his wife had no more favor with him, so he just divorced her. So at the time of Christ, divorce was rampant, and it was already rampant. And when Jesus teaches on it in Matthew 19, he's not telling them what the people wanted to hear. But in the case of the woman caught in adultery, it's kind of, they were trying to trap him, because he could either say, yeah, put her to death, or he could say, which would be very unpopular with the masses, and probably illegal for him to say it, because he wasn't a civil magistrate. It would be like challenging Rome, setting up his own government, so to speak. And the other reason they were testing him was, but are you going to say that we shouldn't do this? I mean, if you're the Messiah and society is going to bring about justice, why aren't you willing to do this? And what Jesus demonstrates is that they're an adulterous people themselves. Let him that is without sin cast the first stone. That doesn't mean any of you that told a white, what we call a white lie, can't throw a stone. What he's really saying is, which one of you doesn't have a mistress? Which one of you isn't guilty? And from the oldest to the youngest, they walked away from him. But he didn't answer their question. He just simply says, where are your condemners? Neither do I condemn you, right? So, and also Malachi, which I could have gotten this scripture. Actually, I think it's Hosea. God says, when your daughters commit adultery, I think it's Hosea 10, I will not punish them, because they're altogether separated with adulterers and harlots and idolaters. And what he was saying is the nation has become so debauched that if I were to start punishing if you were to punish adulterers, the whole nation would be wiped out, right? So it's kind of like that. It's too late for that. It's too late to put away the evil, because the evil has so permeated society that the whole nation would be judged, which it would be judged on a national scale. And that is the thing that happens, is if you don't deal with it in the microcosm and it spreads to the entirety of the nation, the consequences are going to cover the whole nation. You're going to have, for example, declining birth rates, elevated crime. I think even things like inflation. If you may not draw a short line to it, but there's a line to be drawn. When you've got absent fathers, there's a whole lot of women that want the government to be daddy and provider, right? If a father's not in the home, you got all these single mothers saying, I need help. And so what happens, the government says, oh, we're the good charitable state, and then we'll take care of you, which further subsidizes the breakdown of the family. And more and more government programs. One of the ways public education really got big after the Civil War is so many men have been killed in the Civil War that there is further need for government programs to take care of massive numbers of people, because of all it took off very quickly, because you have all these women without husbands who are like, I need a provider. It was an opportunity for politicians to say, we've got a program for that. And it grew and grew. So yeah, when you have a country that every time they want something, they're just printing money, where does that fiscal irresponsibility come from? Where does this huge government come from? Well, functions that used to be handled by the family, the care of the young and the elderly, has now been doled off onto the state. And the result is a big government, lots of taxes, lots of regulations. It's a byproduct of the breakdown of the family. If you have very strong families, you need very little civil government. If you have weak families, the natural cry is, we need help. Uncle Sam, step in and be the dad, right? So there is a relationship, even something like inflation, which is caused by creating money ex nihilo, fiat, out of nothing, leads to inflation. It's an oversupply of the medium of exchange. And where did that come from? Free government stuff, right? I just heard something yesterday. This is a little bit off topic maybe, but I'll just mention it briefly. It was actually a guy on Fox Cavuto, I think, and he was really drilling Biden's Biden's economics guy, and Biden had said something about inflation being at 9% when he took office, and the guy said, no, that's not even true. It wasn't 9% until later, and you were lying when you said it was 9%, and it was actually only 3%, and it later got to 9%. Well, the reality is that inflation doesn't immediately appear. When you start handing out free money to people, inflation comes later. It's a consequence. It's like you plant a seed, it grows up later. So it's not just Biden that's responsible for inflation. So was Trump, so was Obama, so was Bush, so was all the way back to Reagan. Whenever you have people saying, we want free stuff, and the government's like, great, we'll just print more money, eventually you're increasing the money supply, the price of goods is going to go up. And the whole nation took a vacation in 2020, 2021. So what do you expect? And that's on Trump too. Trump's not a small spender, right? People need to take responsibility. For the reality is we wanted free, that the nation as a whole, I don't want to say we, the nation as a whole wanted paid vacation for, they're like, oh, you just give us a check. Keep the masses happy. That would never be tolerated if you had strong families, because they understand, hey, that's eventually coming out of my paycheck, right? Breakdown of the family allows for big government, for big taxation, for lots of government programs. So there's more than a correlation. There's causation. Breakdown of the family leads to chaos, leads to big government. By the transgression of the land, many are the princes thereof. When the land transgresses, it leads to chaos. Nobody can handle chaos. So they say somebody should pass a law about this. Somebody should start a government program to solve this problem. Oh, so you want bigger government. You want more princes. You want more police officers. You want more agencies. Okay. Lack of self-government leads to chaos, leads to big government, leads to high taxes. So eventually, when you don't have, getting back to this, if you don't have purity, you're going to have a breakdown in the family, and if you have a breakdown in family, there are going to be national consequences. So when we read about put them to death, realize that God sees not just the acorn, but the oak tree that grows from the acorn. We look at an acorn and we're like, hey, that's nothing of consequence. I can hold it in my hand. But oak trees grow from acorns. And the sexual revolution led to the statistical problems that we saw on the screen a few minutes ago, and many more besides. Who needs a microphone? Josiah needs a microphone. You want to run it over there, Nori?
You'd said this, I think, a couple weeks ago, but whatever you pay for, you get more of. And I heard a statistic today saying that the governor of California, I believe it was, spent like $25 billion to fight homeless, basically, to try to, take care of that issue. And like after like a year or 2 years, the statistics are not out that it's helped at all.
Right.
But in fact, it's only gotten worse.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yep.
$25 billion for more homeless people to be living in California.
Yeah. And somebody got robbed $25 billion. Some bodies.
Yeah, and some people made a lot of money, too.
You are so right. You are so right. In fact, yeah, I'd like to know if the Pelosi's, which, by the way, Gavin's aunt is like Nancy Pelosi. She and her husband are famous for, there's actually software that tracks their investing, because she's got millions and millions and millions of dollars from investing. It's all insider trading. They know what's going to prosper and what's not. It's like...
Well, she's worth like $250 million, and she's never made over $200K a year, $150K a year.
Is that the number?
Yeah, it's not. It's impossible to have made as much as she's made in the year she's been working.
Yeah, and that can go for defense spending. They can go for all kinds of things. Every time somebody passes people in government power, they get kickbacks. They get secret. Hey, invest in this company, and they're like, I know this is going to go big because we just signed over millions of dollars for this. Even worse, the consequences are just go on and on. And in our mind they're disconnected, but they're not disconnected. When you have a moral and righteous people that practice self-government with civil magistrates that hate covetousness, that doesn't happen. And it goes on even to loss of life. I mean, these foreign wars that we get involved in, it's connected. It'd take a little bit longer for me to draw a line between this and that, but it is connected. You break one of God's commands, they're all connected. You don't get to just break one in a vacuum. It's like a web. You touch one part of it and the whole thing shakes. So the idea of purging the evil from your midst, we can apply that to the state as it is here, but we can also apply it to the individual. So if we take this is on the state getting involved, but this also on our level, the individual dealing with the sin of pornography, or dealing with having very solid boundaries and dating relationships. The rule that I like is I don't want you holding hands. I don't want you holding hands. There's just keep it the conversation going and everything else, but physical affection, touch leads to crest to undress. So keep your hands to yourself till you get married, right? That's a way of doing self-government. I've had so many people laugh at me for that through the years, and I've had some of them, say, I thought you were so crazy, and I have to apologize to you because you were right and I was wrong. I've had that conversation with people because I've been saying that for years. They thought, oh, that's so silly and backwards, but it's kind of confirmation I don't want, but it's true nonetheless. All right, let's look at this next section here so we can get done with this here. If there is a betrothed virgin, so the first one we dealt with was adultery. If there is a betrothed virgin. Now, what's a betrothed? Anybody know what betrothed means? Engaged. And engaged has very little meaning today. People break off engaged, but anybody know what the word fiance means? French word? What does it mean, Marjo? Isn't it a French word? It's based on French, right? It means promised. Promised. It's a promise. Something more than a yay and a nay, right? You have a couple saying, oh, I don't know, do you think, could you ever see yourself marrying me? Oh, I don't know, I'm thinking about it. That's talk, right? But getting down on one knee, will you marry me? And a tenth of a second later, standing up again, yes, I will. That's a promise. Now, in biblical law, it was a lot more formal. A betrothed, like, for example, when Joseph had a betrothed in Mary, in order to break off that relationship, it required a divorce. So it was the legal side of the marriage. The only thing that was left was, it was like contractual. So in this case, there's a woman who is betrothed. The promise has been made. She's been promised to a man already, okay? That's what a betrothed virgin is. She's promised. Some guys out there working, trying to save enough money to come up with 3 years' wages to give to the father. But the promise has been made. That he's like Jacob was, dreaming of Rachel. And it seemed like but a day to him, 7 years, because he was like, every day he got up and went to work, and he's like, but at the end of my 7 years, I'm going to get a wife. And it compelled him to work hard, to be industrious, to do a good job, because he was working with, his hunger spurred him on, right? That's what the dowry did for young men, is rather than being, I don't know what I want to do with my life, it was like, but in the meantime, I'm going to work, and I'm going to save, and I'm going to invest, and I'm going to save up that 3 years. I'm going to get creative. I'm going to work long hours. I'm not going to spend all my money on gaming and drinking and doing this and that. I'm going to work hard, and I'm going to save, because I know that no father in Israel is going to give his virgin daughter to me without 3 years' wages. So it provoked him to thrift and industry and hard work and frugality, all those things. It provoked him to get creative, to work hard. It brings out the best in a young man, when he's working for something. Well, so this man's thinking about this betrothed virgin, all right? And what happens? And a man meets her in the city and lies with her. In the city. Then you shall bring them both out to the gate of that city, and you shall stone them to death with stones. The young woman, because she did not cry out for help, though she was in the city, and the man because he violated his neighbor's wife, so you shall purge the evil from your midst. So if a betrothed virgin was in the city and she whispered, stop, 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 doesn't count. Does it have to be in the city? Could it be in the country? The point is that it's not merely about the venue. The point is, if she had a responsibility then to whisper no. She had a responsibility to say, absolutely not. Help! Right? She's in the city, therefore she can cry out. Now, what does this tell us about the modern rape in America? What we define as rape. Anybody got a thought on that? Actually, you're holding the mic. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, something what pointed it out to me in this.
Okay. Yeah, you're
Sorry. When they brought them out, they 24. Then you shall bring them both out to the gate of the city.
Uh-huh.
What else happens at the gate of the city in the New Testament?
In the what? In the New Testament or Old?
Yeah, the gate of the city. You know, outside of the gate of the city.
Oh, how Jesus was taken outside the gate
Yeah,
and crucified?
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, outside of the bounds of the city. Now, the gates are very significant in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
The gates is where when Jeremiah wants to buy the field of Anathoth, the contract was done in the gate. When Absalom meets the people in the gate and he says, oh, you got a good court case, I would hear you. The gates were the place that contracts were made, judicial decisions were heard. The market is right outside the city gates, so Nehemiah goes and I won't go into all of that, but the gates were the centers of commerce and law and the judiciary. It's where everything legal happened. So the city gates were also the place where this execution was to be done outside. But you're making the point that Jesus was taken outside the city gate, just like these people were done at the gate. Mm-hmm. It was public. It was a public official thing. It was a public execution. And
Correct.
they public executed people in the gate as well. That's
Mm-hmm.
right. That's right. What was the other question? Was that? Oh, rape, modern rape. I don't know if anybody had a comment about that. But one of the big things is today rape has been defined. Todd Aiken got in trouble years ago for talking about real rape, or he used phraseology that upset a lot of people. And I forget what it was, but Todd Aiken was a man that was very acquainted with biblical law. I had conversations with him before that event. And I think what he meant by real rape was, that somebody whispering no in a private setting is a little different than someone walking to their car and a thug jumps out. There's a distinction that needs to be made. Not all crime is equally heinous. We have gradations of injury. And if there's a whisper going on here, the woman is held culpable. She has a responsibility to not merely say, no, it's not a good idea. Because what will happen is some people in the heat of the moment will feel bad about something, and then the next day they'll like, oh my goodness, I can't believe I did that. And the story changes over to, I was raped. And people are going to prison for this, right? People are going to prison for, he raped me. They go, they get a test. Sure enough, the act took place, but in order to satisfy the requirement of this situation, if she's a betrothed virgin, maybe she wants to engage in this activity, and she realized they're going to execute me and him. So what will I do? I will cry rape, right? So he says, no, that won't go in the city. Now it's different if it's in the country. So let me, I have a lot of purging evil verses here. Let me go to this next one. But if in the open country a man meets a young woman who is betrothed, and the man seizes her and lies with her, then only the man who lay with her shall die. But you shall do nothing to the young woman, since she has committed no offense punishable by death. For this case is like that of a man attacking and murdering his neighbor, because he met her in the open country, and though the betrothed young woman cried out for help, there was no one to rescue her. Now here's the thing. This is the only place in biblical law, the only place where a person can be put to death on the basis of one witness. This is the only place. Everywhere else, it says that in order to put anyone to death, it needs 2 or 3 witnesses. The only place where one witness is in the case where a woman is raped and there was no one to hear her. This is it. Which means that the woman's testimony is elevated to that of 2 witnesses in this case. You say, well, man, that doesn't satisfy the qualification of 2 witnesses. No, it doesn't. But what it means is that don't you dare, with consent or without consent, take a betrothed virgin out in the field and do anything with her. That must not be done in Israel. If intercourse took place, the presumption is he's guilty and she's not. So it was a massive deterrent against this. It's the only place where it didn't take 2 or 3 witnesses. On the basis of one woman's testimony, a man could be put to death if she said, I was raped in the fields and no one was there to hear me. The only place where. So a woman's testimony is equal in this case to 2 men's testimony under other circumstances. Not when there's a murder, not when there's a theft, only when she says, I was raped, no one was there, and that's the man that did it. So what that means is that it was very, very, very risky for someone to seduce a woman with or without consent, to seduce or rape a woman in the open in a field or in nature where nobody was around. She would not be held liable, even if she lied, but he would be. So it's a very risky crime in Israel to go and seduce a virgin either in the city or somewhere else. This was a protection to women. One thing that Rushdoony points out is that what we call the Wild West should be reserved for today, because the Wild West really wasn't that wild. Yes, there were gunfights at the OK Corral, and they were highly publicized. There were cattle rustlers who would get hung. That happened. There were natives. There was conflict. But one thing that happened in the Wild West, women could safely walk down the street at any time of night, and they weren't going to be raped. Virtually all these old Western or these new Western movies, they show women being abused in the West. There was prostitution, but a woman who was dressed. Now I know for a fact incest took place, but as far as a woman walking down the street, we live in much more dangerous times than in the 1800s. Women are far more dangerous today in our society than in the 1800s. There was a sense if a criminal raped a woman in the street, he was going to be treated very severely. And so it was actually safer then for women than it is today. And in a biblical society where a man could be put to death for even seducing a woman if she said she was raped, it was a very big deterrent. You see what I'm saying? It was a very big deterrent to that crime, which we have in much more abundance than they did. Anybody got any comments on that? All right, let's go on to the next one here. Now, what about a non-betrothed woman? What's the consequence? Verse 28. If a man meets a virgin who is not betrothed, no one's saving up 3 years' wages for her, and sees her and lies with her, and they are found, then the man who lay with her shall give to the father of the young woman 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife. Because he has violated her, he may not divorce her all his days. Now, this is a very offensive law to modernity. And people say, well, this is, a man could rape a woman and get fined $50. That's, first of all, like I said, 50 shekels is about 3 years' wages. It's a very significant sum, which I proved last time with quotes of what like a third of a shekel was the tax for all of Israel. It was a massive amount of money. 50 shekels was a whole lot of money, enough to deter the crime so it wouldn't take place. But here's a parallel passage, it's in Exodus 22:16. It's basically the same law, but it's a little more clear. Exodus, which came before Deuteronomy, so Deuteronomy is kind of a reminder of what Exodus says. If a man seduces a virgin who is not betrothed and lies with her, he shall give the bride price for her and make her his wife. If her father utterly refuses to give her to him, he shall pay money equal to the bride price of virgins. So if a man seduced a non-betrothed virgin, he had to pay 50 shekels, the dowry of virgins, 3 years' wages, and the father could say to her, You're giving me 3 years' wages, and there's no way I'm giving my daughter to you, jerk. This made it a very unprofitable crime to commit. Had very serious economic consequences. And therefore, it would purge not in a death penalty sense, but monetarily, it was something not to be done. Something Canaanites did, like the men of Shechem, but not something that would be done in Israel, because it reduces you almost to, it made it a very pricey thing to do, right? So that's for a non-betrothed. Now, why you say, well, who would want to marry the person that forced them or seduced them? Well, quite a few cases. She isn't betrothed, so she has no prospects. If she doesn't have any prospects yet, she may not get any prospects. Maybe she said, well, the guy's a jerk, but I'd rather have him than no husband. Some women would say that. It was a choice. But the father could say, no way, you seduced my daughter, and there's no way I want a scoundrel like you for a son-in-law, so get lost after you give me 50 shekels of silver. It was a serious offense. Yeah, Brian, you want the microphone?
I guess my main question is, why wouldn't that not have been enumerated in the second giving of the law? Because it seems like a big, omission. So that's number one. But number two would be, once this virgin had been spoiled, her prospects of having a husband at all would have been non-existent, right? I mean, it would have condemned her to a life of solitude or singleness. And I think that would have been a curse that some women would never, it would be more shame than taking the guy who forced his way on her,
I think you're correct. In that society, and in many societies to this day, that would be the case. Is she's like, if I don't take him, I might never get married. And in the Exodus case, it was seduces. So I'll answer your question about the second giving of the law in a minute. After let me read the next law, and then I'll answer that. Deuteronomy 20, the last verse that we have tonight. A man shall not take his father's wife so that he does not uncover his father's nakedness. So he says, basically if he marries his stepmother, for example, could be his biological mother, but his stepmother, which there's a case where this happens. David had a wife that he never even slept with, and Adonijah wants to marry her in the book of Kings. And Solomon was very offended. He saw it as actually an attempt to establish himself as the king, because it's something outside the law, and it was to them it symbolized taking on the father's role, and Solomon had him, dispatched early to the judgment seat, had him executed. So anyway, this is actually, though, kind of a summary of a lot more laws that uses the same phrase. A man shall not take his father's wife.
Let's try again.
Siri's listening to me. Hang up, Siri. I don't want to talk to you. This phrase, let me read it again, and I'll read a little bit of Leviticus. A man shall not take his father's wife so that he does not uncover his father's nakedness. In other words, that's his father's wife, and you're going into his territory if you take his mother. Here's what it says in Leviticus. This is a summation of a lot more laws, is the point, Brian, is that Leviticus gives a whole lot more, and Deuteronomy just alludes to it. But it's much bigger than just that. None of you shall approach any of his close relatives to uncover nakedness. I am the Lord. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father, which is the nakedness of your mother. She is your mother. You shall not uncover her nakedness. You shall not uncover, that's a quote right there from what, it's basically the same thing as what we just read in Deuteronomy. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife. It is your father's nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your sister, your father's daughter, or your mother's daughter, whether brought up in the family or in another home. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your son's daughter or of your daughter's daughter, for their nakedness is your own nakedness. The point is that all close relations are forbidden, and I didn't even give you all of them. I gave you the ones that fit on a screen. This is also the chapter that speaks about homosexuality, bestiality, human sacrifice, etc. And says, for all of these sins, the land vomited out its inhabitants, and this is why God judged the Canaanites, because they engage in incest, adultery, homosexuality, bestiality, etc. For that reason, God had them go in and conquer these people because they become so immoral. But it's basically a summation of it, and kind of the same thing is that I think going back to Brian's question, why doesn't it in the second giving of the law give the same amount in Exodus? Well, the Deuteronomy is a confirmation of the covenant to the generation 40 years later. It doesn't cover every detail. At times it words things differently. So it's not word for word verbatim. It's not simply a reading of Exodus. It's a second giving of the law. Sometimes it expands and expounds on it, and sometimes it gives less. It's just the way it is. Like even the Ten Commandments are worded differently. Exodus emphasizes that God created the earth in 6 days and on the seventh rested. Deuteronomy emphasizes he delivered them out of Egypt, right? On the commandment to remember the Sabbath day. The one talks about remember the Sabbath. The other one says keep the Sabbath. There's little differences. There are nuances that are different, and you're supposed to think about why they're different. But they're expected to also read Exodus, not just Deuteronomy, I think is my general answer to it. Yeah, Dan. You need a microphone. You don't have to turn that off every time, Nora. You can just leave it on and hand it to him.
I think the most powerful thing that points out to me is the gate part, is because...
Is the what part?
The gate.
The gate, okay.
Yeah, because where they crucified Jesus, they treated him just like us.
That's right.
They treated him just like any other sinner who was addicted to pornography, who was addicted to sexual immorality, who's addicted to anger or anything like that.
Murderers,
rapists. Mm-hmm. They treated him just like that.
That's a very good insight. They treated the Holy Lamb of God like the vilest of sinners.
Yes.
And it's good you mentioned that because I briefly want to look at this phrase, purging of evil. I just want to give you a visual of how this phrase, purging evil, and then I want to go to the New Testament, and it's 8:04, so I need about another 6-7 minutes. So here's like this. So in the text we read, so she purged from evil, multiple times, like 3-4 times. Here in Deuteronomy 13:5, it's used. So you purge evil from your midst. Talking about false prophets that were trying to lead them after other gods. Deuteronomy 17:7, false witnesses. You do to them whatever they want to do to others. So shall you purge evil from your midst. Then verse 12, so shall you purge evil from Israel. Verse 19:13, so shall you purge the guilt of innocent blood from Israel. Verse 19, so shall you purge the evil from your midst. Deuteronomy 21:9, so shall you purge the innocent blood from your midst when you do what is right in the sight of the Lord. Deuteronomy 21:21, so shall you purge the evil from your midst, and all Israel shall hear and fear. Deuteronomy 22:21-22, which we're reading now, same phrase. Deuteronomy 22:21-22, same phrase. Verse 24, same phrase, so shall you purge the evil from your midst. Deuteronomy 24:7, again, it says, so shall you purge the evil from your midst, and underline it there. So this is used like 7 or 8 times. This idea of purging evil from your midst. This is used, I know of, at least one time in the New Testament, and it's in relation to this last one here about the forbidden father's wife. A man shall not take his father's wife so that he does not uncover his father's nakedness. Now, Paul alludes to this law directly in the New Testament in 1 Corinthians 5. Verse 1, it is actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you, and of a kind that is not tolerated even among pagans, for a man has his father's wife. And you are arrogant. Ought you not rather to mourn? Let him who has done this be removed from among you. That concept of purging, the word purge in Hebrew literally means to burn up, to destroy, meaning it's to be just removed, like totally vanquished. Ought you not rather to mourn? Let him who has done this be removed from among you. Put away the evil from among you. For though absent in body, I am present in spirit, and as if present, I have already pronounced judgment on the one who did such a thing. When you are assembled in the name of the Lord Jesus, and my spirit is present, with the power of our Lord Jesus, you are to deliver this man to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, so that his spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord. So basically what he's saying is, we don't have civil power, but the church has to deal with this. And you're to hand him over. This language is the language of execution, but it's in the church. Because this is saying basically, we don't have the power to put people to death, but the church needs to take this so seriously that you have a ceremonial excommunication. You're putting him out of the midst. Your boasting is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Cleanse out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, as you really are unleavened. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Let us therefore celebrate the festival, not with the old leaven, the leaven of malice and evil, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Now, when we take the Lord's Supper, that's the New Testament Passover. We do it weekly, not yearly. And notice it says that we're to judge ourselves, right? So we would not be judged. Paul picks up on this analogy, and just like they would get the leaven out of their house on Passover, he's saying get the sin out of the body. It's a metaphor. Get the leaven out is a metaphor for get sin out of the church. You need to deal with heinous immorality. Of course, we're all sinners, but heinous death penalty offenses need to be dealt with in the church, ecclesiastically. I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people. Not at all meaning the sexually immoral of the world, or the greedy or swindlers or idolaters, since then you would need to go out of the world. So those are things covered here. So if we have an unbeliever come into church and they're living in sexual immorality, we don't hold them to the same standard as believers. That's what Paul's saying. They're to be loved, respected, and evangelized. Verse 11, but now I am writing you not to associate with anyone who bears the name of brother if he is guilty of sexual immorality or greed, or is an idolater, reviler, drunkard, or swindler, not even to eat with such a one. For what have I to do with judging outsiders? Is it not those inside the church whom you are to judge? God judges those outside. Now here's the phrase, purge the evil person from among you. He is quoting Deuteronomy, and those 7 or 8 times where this phrase is used of a death penalty offense. And it's not limited to sexual immorality. He mentions revilers, drunkards, swindlers, idolaters. One of the Deuteronomy passages deal with somebody who was seducing people to idolatry. In the book of Revelation, we could have gone there. You know, he says, you've got this wicked woman, Jezebel, seducing my servants to commit fornication, to eat things sacrificed to idols. And what's Jesus' problem with them? He says, you're not dealing with it. So I'm going to come and I'm going to throw her into a bed of fire and those that commit fornication with her. In other words, you didn't deal with it, I'm going to deal with it. Same thing with false teachers in the church. You didn't deal with it, I'm going to come and fight against them with the sword of my mouth. And so what Jesus is saying is that as a church, in the body of Christ, you know, we're not out here in the public sphere executing people, but the general equity principle of purity is still very relevant to us. And the same language of purging the evil can be applied to, like it is here, the church, but it also can apply to us as individuals. Purging out of our life things that aren't pleasing to the Lord. Now, every time we come to the communion table, we're to judge ourselves so that we will not be judged. What are we doing? We're in our own lives, we're bringing our sin to the Lord's table, and we're saying, God, I need help. I failed. I've sinned. Cleanse me. Purge me. Get this out of my life. And so every week we read the law of God. We expound the law of God. We worship God. We come to the Lord's table. We have a moment of silence. The music is playing. We bow our head. That's the time to say, God, search me, try me, know my thoughts. See if there be any wicked way in me. Why? So we can have it purged. So we can purge it. It applies to the individual. It applies to the family. When we have little toddlers, little children, the purpose of corporal punishment is to purge the evil from their life. When we see rebellion, when we see lack of self-control, you know, for a child, for a little child, it might be lust for chocolate. For an adult, it's lust for the opposite sex, but it's the same. At root, we want to establish internal self-discipline when they're little so that when they grow up, they're not fornicators, swindlers, drunkards, idolaters, etc. The purpose of government, including family government, church government, civil government, church government is more than an association on Sunday morning. Church government is a governing factor in our life whereby we submit to one another, we hold each other accountable, we exhort one another, and when someone refuses to repent, it's painful but necessary at times, just like it's painful but necessary to amputate a gangrenous limb. At times, it's necessary to purge a person from your midst. Now, the evidence is this individual in 1 Corinthians 5. Anybody know what happened to him? What? He's restored in 2 Corinthians. This is the person that you dealt with the first time, restore them. So in that case, he was restored to fellowship. In the Old Testament sense, when Achan sins in the accursed thing, Joshua says, confess your sin, my son. And he says, yep, I did it. Well, he went on, they executed him. But at least he confessed his sin. So maybe we'll see Achan and his family in heaven, I don't know. But he was executed for a civil crime, but he also confessed his sin. And what 1 Corinthians 5 says is that you hand the person over to the destruction of the body so that their spirit can be saved. There's nothing that says a person can't be executed and still be saved. But, or be excommunicated and then be restored. But the responsibility for the sake of the body, for the sake of restraining evil, for the sake of purging evil from our midst, as individuals, as families, as the church, and as the civil government, if you don't want more murder, you need to put murderers to death. That's the general principle. All right, I've spoken a lot. Any more comments? Okay, so, wait a second. Go ahead and ask it online.
So for the guy that had to pay the fine of 7 years of labor for falsely accusing the virgin, what happened on the year of Jubilee? Did he still have to fulfill all 7 years?
Well, in this case, it doesn't say slavery. It says the 100 shekels of silver. So I don't think that he gets off the hook. It doesn't say slavery. When I say he's effectively a slave, I say that in the same sense that, somebody that's got $150,000 of college debt to learn basket weaving. His degree's not paying for it. He's effectively very limited. You know what I mean? It's not actual slavery. It's just he owes a huge sum of money to the father, and in a society that enforces such things. So I don't think he's off the hook because this is a penalty for what the Bible shows to be to falsely accuse. This just shows you the value too of what purity is. To falsely accuse a woman of not being a virgin when she was is an extremely evil libel or slander. Libel for written, slander verbal. In our society, it's of little consequence. But for them, it was of serious consequence. And that's why when I named this, a purity revolution, we've had, when Christianity begins to teach this, it's been world transforming. And the sexual revolution was not progress, it was a regress. It's going back to what our pagan ancestors did to begin with. And so, as God's people, Matt Chandler a few years ago, I don't need to go into that, but people refuse to preach on the subject anymore. And we have to, because church is for believers. And it's not that we want to beat up unbelievers it's that the law shows us our sin, and rightly understood should lead us to Jesus, because we all need his forgiveness and grace. But also, this needs to be enculturated, and I believe it is at Church of the Word. I believe it is at Church of the Word for those that are growing up in the church anyway. Not necessarily for everybody that comes, And I know we still have, I'm confident there's still struggles with pornography, and this is just very pervasive, but we need to encourage a culture of purity and fight the battle. You know, it's like trench warfare. Don't give up any more ground than you've already given up. Hold the line, right? You know, you may have lost some battles and been pushed back. Hold the line, press forward. And it may take a long time to get to the next, to gain a little more battlefield, but in the midst of a crumbling culture around us, God's way wins. You know, first of all, God restores those and cleanses those that are defiled and unclean, and we're new creatures in Christ Jesus, which is wonderful and beautiful. But also doing things God's way, man, what a blessing! What a blessing to do it, to be raised in a culture and a home that encourages purity is a huge blessing over the massive amounts of guilt and shame and fear that so many in the world around us, people, you know, the whole world just talks like their sexual revolution is the greatest thing. But man, there is so much emptiness and sadness and guilt and shame, feelings of inferiority, all these things that come with the world's way. It's something that we should want for ourselves and our children, is to create a culture of purity. We need another purity revolution, and to counter the sexual revolution that's been so devastating in our society. All righty. Well,
I use it to try to feel wanted again during that time when I was backsliding.
mhm.
I never felt wanted until I came back to Christ.
Yeah. And, you know, people say that, oh, men don't have that, you know, but that's not true. It's not true. Lots of people, men and women, struggling with great rejection issues. So we pray for that. All righty. Zach, would you close us in prayer tonight?
Yeah. Thank you, Lord, for bringing us all here tonight, together, fellowship together, to learn more about your word. Tonight, throughout the rest of the week and the weekend. Pray, Lord, that you protect us all on our way home, and please strengthen all of us in Christ's name. We pray.
We are done with that chapter. So next week we're moving on, chapter 23.